So hello everybody and welcome to today's presentation. Before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. Everyone but the presenters are on mute, but please send your questions at any time via the question toolbox at the upper right-hand corner of the GoToWebinar window. I'm sure you already know this, but try to close any extra windows to prevent buffering. We're recording today's webinar and we'll email it to everyone within about 24 hours after the webinar is over. So with that, let's get started. All right, so I will ask the panelists to turn their cameras on if they haven't already. We've got a great roster of speakers today. Let me briefly introduce them and then they can provide a little more detail individually. We have Kathy Fulton here from ALAN, the American Logistics Aid Network. I'm sure a lot of you know Kathy, but she's been part of ALAN for almost 12 years and is currently the executive director. I'm also joined today by John Davis, senior meteorologist, and Mark Russo, Chief Science Officer at Everstream Analytics. And I'm Leslie Hume with Everstream Analytics as well. So we have a lot to cover in today's agenda. First, Kathy Fulton will provide an overview of the American Logistics Aid Network and some of the climate and weather disasters that have impacted logistics networks in 2021. Then, since we're going to be talking about the 2022 tropical storm insights prepared by the meteorology team at Everstream, I'll provide a quick and brief overview of who Everstream is. Then I'll turn it over to John Davis and Mark Russo to provide their 2022 tropical storm outlook. And once we're finished, we'll open up the webinar and take your questions. So with that, Kathy, over to you.
All right, thank you so much, Leslie, and I appreciate all of you joining us today. As Leslie said, I'm Kathy Fulton. I'm the Executive Director of ALAN, or American Logistics Aid Network. So really what I want to do is just briefly introduce our organization and share a little bit about why today's conversation around weather is so important to us. Next slide, please. So ALAN is a nonprofit organization formed by members of the supply chain profession. We started right after Hurricane Katrina, 17 years ago almost, with 13 of these industry associations that you see here. We've grown to partner with over 30 supply chain and logistics professional associations. Next slide, please. So our mission is really simple. We want to harness the power of logistics and supply chain activities to save lives and reduce suffering after a disaster. And we do that in a few different ways. The most visible way we're doing that is through coordinating logistics solutions for the nonprofit community. But that's to help them deliver food, water, medicine, other resources that are desperately needed after disasters. And we're able to match generous donations of logistics services or equipment or expertise from the business community with those nonprofits to ensure disaster survivors get what they need faster. And we also want to help improve the way humanitarian response occurs. And we want to do that by reducing the need for response activities, by helping build resilient supply chains. And we do that by providing some educational resources. We truly believe in the power of relationships to help build this resilience. So we convene cross-industry and cross-sector conversations to help build community connections. Finally, and the reason we're all here today is our work that is around enabling better decision-making before, during, after crisis. And we partner with Everstream for our Supply Chain Intelligence Center to help show those predictive and real-time conditions at shared logistics infrastructure across the United States. So our work in the disaster space is fairly broad, but we know that the more we can do to support continuity of supply chains, the better the outcome is going to be for the communities who've been affected by crisis. Next slide, please. And unfortunately, the need for our work is growing because disasters, and especially weather-related disasters, are increasing in scope and scale. You can see in 2021, the United States had 20 weather-related disasters that caused over $1 billion in damages. And that doesn't even take into account the continuing impacts from the pandemic or the economic impacts from the resulting global supply chain disruptions. So we know that businesses are continually challenged on how to prepare for, withstand, and recover from these types of events. And unfortunately, many don't. But Alan believes that if they have a more awareness of the true potential impacts to their businesses, they can be better prepared. It's hard to prepare for something that you don't believe is going to happen. That's why we love being able to see kind of the predictive analytics. Next slide, please. And I should note that while we're going to focus today on the 2022 hurricane season, we know that even the hurricanes we're going to talk about are no longer just a coastal problem. We can even think back to just last year with Hurricane Ida that swept across the entirety of the eastern U.S., bringing flooding well beyond that initial landfall in southeast Louisiana. And through our partnership with Everstream, we were able to use the Supply Chain Intelligence Center to really help notify our responding partners about the probable impacts to roads and power infrastructure and lots of other shared logistics resources. Having that information early really helped enable them to make decisions about how they were going to respond. Next slide, please. And before I hand it back to Leslie, I have to do the 30-second commercial for Alan and just share with you how you can help us. We rely on the generosity of the business community to help provide that transportation or warehousing equipment expertise that we use to serve disaster survivors. And we would really appreciate any help that your organization can provide. And so there's 3 ways you can help Alan. You can offer to provide donated logistics services. We are always looking to expand our network of service providers. You can make a financial contribution to help keep us ready to respond year-round. Or you can volunteer with any of the programs that I mentioned today. We love volunteers. And I've of course put a QR code on the screen because I'm a nerd that way, but I'll get you to the right place to get more information about us. So thank you all. Thank you to Everstream. And with that, Leslie, it is back to you to continue the conversation. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kathy. I'm always so impressed with the work that you guys do at the American Logistics Aid Network. So great insights, that's for sure.
Thank you.
All right, so moving along here. Okay, so a little bit about Everstream, and I'll make this brief. So at Everstream, we like to say that we keep the world moving by keeping risk out of the way. Every day, we look at billions of data points out of a magnitude of data sources to create customer supply chain specific insights. We're here to make risk management a part of all supply chain processes by ingesting the right insight at the right time to the right process. You've already invested more than likely heavily into your supply chain organization and IT infrastructure. We incorporate risk management into both so you can make more out of your investment. Never was this more important than it is today. And throughout this webinar, you'll hear our meteorologists discuss insights based on huge amounts of data. This is the root of the challenge and where we focus much of our efforts. We're processing billions, if not trillions of data points every day, as are many companies. But the difference is the processing is more effective since we have years of curated historical data to train predictive models and have multilingual teams, and those teams to be in the same regions as our client supply chains is vital. So that, I told you it was going to be brief, and it was. So with that, what does the 2022 tropical storm outlook look like? Well, I'm not sure about you, but I'll be taking a lot of notes. Living on the Florida Atlantic coast, I'm always a bit anxious at this time of the year as the storm season officially kicks off next week. John and Mark, over to you. What's it going to look like this year?
Great, thank you so much, Leslie. And it's wonderful to be here, especially sharing the stage here with Kathy and with Alan, who are doing wonderful things kind of out there again to prepare organizations to save lives and to, again, mitigate risk as much as we possibly can with the hurricane season upcoming. I guess the theme of today's presentation is, are you ready? And Mark and I are going to talk about, are you ready from a standpoint of the atmospheric component or the risks ahead with the hurricane season, primarily in the Atlantic basin. But first things first, we're going to begin to talk about climatology. There's a reason that we're having this webinar in May, because the season is quickly approaching, and we'll talk about some of the specifics first of all on what we term the climatology of the overall season. So next slide, Leslie. So we're mainly going to focus today on the Atlantic basin. That includes the Gulf of Mexico, the Caribbean, and the Atlantic. And this is the timeline that looks at tropical storm and hurricane activity during the season. So this is a long-term look in a lot of years on average. This is all storms from 1944 to 2020. And looking at the timeline of risk and looking at when it is more or less likely to get impacts from tropical activity. So the season typically begins late May, early June. That's why we're having this webinar now, but it doesn't really ramp up, the risk that is, until we get into August, September, and early October. So the core of the season, when risk is the highest, it begins in early to mid-August. September is the most active month. Early October is very active. And then by late in the season, November and early December, it tends to wane. If we look at the true midpoint, halftime, if you will, of the tropical storm season, that's September 10th. So that is the middle point of the season overall. And this timeline, which again, in this case, goes back many, many decades, this has also changed a little bit over the last 10 or 15 years. The seasons are getting a little bit longer. So we have more of an incidence of having storms earlier, late May, early June, than we used to 2, 3, 4 decades ago. And also, we tend to have storms a little bit later into November and early December. Much of that is a function of global water temperatures and the warming that we've seen of global water temperatures. So this is the general timeline of the Atlantic basin, but the length of the season has been increasing over the last 10 or 15 years especially, and that's certainly something that we expect to continue from this point on, the risk, if you will. So now we're going to go on and we're going to begin to look at what we call ACE and looking at overall risk out there. So there's ways that you can quantify or measure a season out there. You can measure it by number of named storms. Lots of individuals kind of do that. We feel the better way is to look at ACE, accumulated cyclone energy, because that takes into account intensity of storms and duration of storms. If you have 10 hurricanes that are very weak in a season, or 10 hurricanes that are very strong in a season, the risk of those 2 years are totally different, but each one has 10 named storms. That's why most meteorologists use ACE to quantify the amount of activity during a season and thus the amount of risk. And so when we talk about the upcoming season, we're going to deal with it from an ACE standpoint, accumulated cyclone energy of a season. Is the risk going into the season higher than normal, or is the risk lower than normal going in? So this chart that we're looking at looks at every year of ACE. We start in 1979 and we go through last year. So let's look at some of the numbers. Next slide, Leslie. So as we look at some of the numbers here overall, if you look at the average over this timeline from 1979 to last year, the average amount of ACE is 111. Last year, the red line on the overall graph is 145. So last year, we had well above normal tropical activity and hurricanes and well above normal risk. Now, the season with the highest risk was 2005, infamous season of Katrina and others. Had huge ramifications out there. The most interesting item on this overall chart is the fact is what's happened over the last 6 years. We've had 6 consecutive seasons of above normal tropical activity in the Atlantic basin. That is unprecedented. Even going back well further back than what this graph depicts, we've never had 6 consecutive years of above normal risk or above normal hurricane activity across the Atlantic basin. So one of the main goals that we have today is answering the question, are we going to have the 7th year of above normal ACE and above normal risk across the Atlantic basin, or will this year be quite a bit different? So as we look at that, and again, this would make it even more anomalous, more unprecedented if we had this year being the 7th consecutive season of above normal hurricane activity. From all the research that we've done over the past 4 to 5 weeks with the applied meteorology team at Everstream Analytics, we're pretty emphatic in saying that the answer to this question is yes. And overall here, it's one of the things we'll talk about now is to some of the variables that will be driving this forecast. Why do we think that this is going to be a very active season with above normal risk from an overall supply chain standpoint in the Atlantic basin? So now we're going to talk about the drivers, talk about the variables behind this important statement. And I'm going to turn it over to Mark, and now we'll take a look at some of the variables here that are driving the forecast here for this year. Mark?
Great, thanks, John, and good day, everybody. So bottom line, yes, we are expecting another active season in the Atlantic basin. And one of the primary drivers or reasons behind our expectation is tied to sea surface temperatures or warmth in the oceans or the state of the oceans, not only just in the Atlantic or the Atlantic basin, but actually more importantly, in areas of the Eastern Pacific. We have an ongoing La Nina event. That's the area of cooler than normal water temperatures in the Eastern Pacific. And we expect that La Nina to continue over the next several months, basically throughout the entire upcoming hurricane season. And as a result of its persistence here, it will be the 3rd consecutive year with a La Nina event in the Pacific Ocean. And this is very important in that with La Nina events, what that tends to do in the Atlantic basin is it actually suppresses wind shear, which will result typically in the development of more storms, and not only in development, but in different parts of the basin. And also, once storms formed, they kind of, a lack of any kind of wind shear actually keeps storms being maintained from a strength standpoint and from a duration standpoint. So overall, there is a very strong correlation or relationship between La Nina events and an active year in the Atlantic basin. Next slide, please. So to show an example of why La Nina events are very important and how that compares to other states of the ocean, we're going to show a few examples. So we're going to take a step back. We're actually going to look at El Nino events in the Pacific. Those are warmer than normal water temperatures. And we're going to look at all the tracks of named storms, tropical storms or hurricanes since 2000. So that's the map that you're viewing right now. So over the past 20 plus years, these are all of the tracks of storms during these El Nino seasons. And you can see here, there are storms of various magnitudes. They take up much of the basin, but if you take a closer look at the western part of the Gulf of Mexico, or for that matter, the western part of the Caribbean, you can see an overall lack of tracks across that region. So El Nino events tend to suppress tropical storm tracks and intensity, especially in that western part of the basin, in portions of the western Gulf of Mexico or the western part of the Caribbean. And since 2000, there have been 65 storms that have tracked through the basin during these El Nino seasons. Now compare that to La Ninas. And if we go to the next slide, you can see here it's a different story here. 107 named storms have tracked through the basin during La Nina season since 2000. And you can see that there's additional tracks there in the western part of the Gulf of Mexico and in the western Caribbean. So from a La Nina standpoint, what that does is opens the door to more activity in the basin and actually helps to steer storms further west through the Caribbean or through the Gulf of Mexico, or it allows them to develop a bit more closer to the US, which is important because the closer that storms develop or maintain their intensity as they're tracking towards the US, there's more risk of disruptions and issues for business operations and supply chain networks. So with the La Nina event in place, expected to remain in place, we are expecting above normal activity, and the risk of issues is heightened this year, both on the Gulf Coast as well as along the East Coast. Next slide, please. Also important are what sea surface temperatures are doing within the Atlantic basin. So as we take a look at the current state of sea surface temperatures in the Gulf of Mexico, in the Caribbean, in what we call the main development region for tropical activity between Africa and the Caribbean, or off the east coast of the US, you can see that there are some specific areas of warmer than normal waters and slightly cooler than normal waters. The thing that stands out to us and we feel is very important for this season, and we'll be talking a lot about that in the months ahead, that's with the warmer than normal sea surface temperatures, those warm pockets that you see in the Gulf of Mexico, off the coast of Texas or eastern Mexico or southeast of New Orleans there. You see that anomalous warmth. And that's some of the warmest readings that we've seen for this later May timeframe, going back over the past 20 years or so. As you move away from the Gulf of Mexico, then SSTs start to trend a bit more closer to normal in the Caribbean and in the main development region in the Atlantic. So those areas are kind of unnoteworthy right now. But the most anomalous conditions are in the Gulf of Mexico. Now, we will note that SSTs can change in these areas pretty quickly, and that's different than the La Nina area of the Pacific, where SSTs tend to change, slowly. So we'll be monitoring here in the weeks and months ahead any of the sea surface temperature changes, but that's important, especially in the Gulf of Mexico. And again, why warmer than normal waters are important is that that's the fuel for individual storms. And so anytime you have a named storm track across one of those warmer or hot pockets that you see, then it tends to have more fuel for development. And that's where you can see either rapidly intensifying storms or just storms strengthening to more severe levels. And obviously with it being close to the Gulf Coast, then there's more risk of significant storm activity or a significantly stronger storm if one moves across that hot pocket. And we did see that a year ago. Some similarities is what we saw with Hurricane Ida tracking across a hot pocket in the Gulf of Mexico late August and early September of last year. Next slide. So when wrapping things up here and putting everything together, again, because of our La Nina event ongoing, we expect above normal activity in the Atlantic basin. And as a result of that, we do feel there is above normal risk of impacts and risk to business operations, supply chain networks, and overall transportation corridors on the Gulf Coast and the East Coast. And so those associated nodes and lanes within those regions obviously includes major population centers such as Houston, New Orleans, Florida cities, including Miami and Tampa, and then up the East Coast. These areas have a greater than climatological risk of seeing issues because of the active season that is expected here. And then connecting those main cities and nodes include some key interstates, including I-95 on the East Coast, I-10 along the Gulf Coast, and then some of the north-south corridors and interstates such as I-75, I-55, and I-65. And then also to consider if you do have any particular rail carriers within this zone here, and basically all of the major rail carriers and lanes are within the East and Gulf Coast, including CSX, Norfolk Southern, Union Pacific, to name a few. But all in all, those kind of southern and eastern transportation corridors do have above normal risk. So for anybody with their supply chain networks having any kind of exposure in portions of the Gulf Coast, East Coast, then recommend that you prepare in advance here for, again, expecting a higher risk of activity. And as always the case, and into any season, you always need to be prepared for impacts of tropical activity or other kind of potential weather impacts. But again, this season, as we've seen the past couple of seasons, there is just more risk of potential issues given the oceanic and the atmospheric base state. And we got a long ways to go with the season, but the earlier that you can prepare here, obviously the better. And any kind of exposure in your supply chain networks or logistical operations there in the southern and eastern US, then mitigate your risk here and be prepared here as soon as possible. One last comment here before I hand it back over to Leslie, and kind of tying this to what Kathy said earlier in terms of what we've seen here lately, some storms such as Hurricane Ida from a year ago track further inland. And that's another trend that we've seen with tropical activity in recent years. So again, you can see impacts well from the coast. And that's especially true in terms of heavy rainfall and flooding. And obviously, we've seen a lot of flood impacts to transportation and supply chain networks in recent years due to more kind of inland tropical activity and the heavy rainfall that takes place in association with that. So with that, let me turn it back over to Leslie.
Thank you, John and Mark. I'm nervous now, I have to be honest, but it's not about me. So let's move into some Q&A. All right, so thank you, Kathy, John, and Mark. If you guys can turn your cameras on again, that would be lovely. And I really appreciate the insights that you've shared with all of us today. So just as a reminder, as we're sitting in Q&A, you can submit your questions using the button at the right-hand side of the screen or wherever you've moved it, I guess. It looks like we've already got some questions, some great questions actually. So let me delve right in. Kathy, this one is for you actually. What is Alan doing to prepare for hurricane season?
Oh, that's a great question because it is a very busy time for us right now. Primarily because of the way Alan is organized, we're working with our partners. We're working with them, the business community, to help them understand where to go for intelligence. So promoting conversations like this. We're also helping them understand how they can help other people if their business is not affected. We're also helping government understand, hey, what's really going on with the business community right now? I mentioned all the disruptions that we have to supply chains. Those are not slowing down. It's not stopping just because we're heading towards June 1st, right? We don't get a pass because of that. So really, it's about sharing that information. It's about tying, strengthening these partnerships, and making sure that everyone knows how to collaborate, coordinate, and cooperate when something does happen. So thanks for that question.
Thank you. Okay, here's another one that just came in. I read recently with the unusually warm water, in the Gulf and the lack of El Nino in the fall, it's tracking in line with the history of the Katrina weather year. Thoughts, John and Mark?
Yeah, so obviously 2005 was, in the graph that we showed, that was the most active season ever recorded, one of the most damaging seasons ever recorded. There are certainly some similarities to 2005, but the way that we think about that is that that was the perfect scenario, the perfect storm, if you will. Kind of hate to use that term, but the perfect storm, if you will, where all the variables were perfectly in order to make that season as infamous as it was. It started early, it ended late. You had incredibly strong storms the entire season. Every variable, oceanic wise and atmospheric wise, was perfectly in line that year. We don't have that this year going in. It's not to say that we're not going to have a very active year, but all of the variables here overall were not perfect in that scenario. One of the things in '05 that was crucially important was the fact that we had such warm waters in the Gulf of Mexico. We had what we call a loop current that moves from the Caribbean into the Gulf, and that's extremely warm waters with depth. With that loop current in the middle of the Gulf, that's what Katrina went over. So there was upwelling of warm waters into Katrina, a very high octane environment. And it's one of the reasons why Katrina was Katrina. We don't have it in place here right now. Could get there later on in the season, but again, you would never go from what we know now saying that this year is going to be like 2005, the most infamous year of all time. We think it's going to be an active year, but to have a year like that, the highest risk ever in the highest year ever, you have to have everything kind of in that perfect category, and not everything as of today is in that perfect category. So not at 2005 levels, but certainly an active year is likely as we look at this year.
Thanks, John. So the next question reads, can you advise how the AMO phenomenon is impacting the forecasted activity in the upcoming Atlantic Basin season? And maybe for all of our benefit, define AMO.
I'll answer that question. Yeah, AMO stands for Atlantic Multidecadal Oscillation, and basically it's an oscillation of water temperatures across the Atlantic, including the main development region for tropical activity, but also a little bit further north in areas of the mid-Atlantic waters. And so it's a common, what we call meteorological teleconnection. So a question may have come from a meteorologist or someone that has a lot of weather interest there. So, but with what we're seeing right now with the AMO and what I showed earlier on the slide of water temperatures in the Atlantic is that Atlantic waters are somewhat closer to normal, or at least compared to the past 10 years. And so with that being normal right now, again, things could change as we go a bit through the season, but because of that kind of neutral AMO, just slightly warmer than normal AMO, that's actually one of the reasons that we kind of, not going the route of a 2005, because you had a very strong positive AMO or warm Atlantic that year. And we don't have that this year. And it would be pretty unlikely for waters in the Atlantic to warm up that quick for that to be a significant change in that. But that is this more kind of neutral AMO. Again, that's one factor that at least pointing away from a repeat of a 2005 season.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Mark. So the next question reads for either John or Mark. Are there any data sets that are publicly available on supply chain disruptions due to major hurricane events in the past?
I can take that. There are. And there are data sets that look at the big disruptions and what are the industry sectors and even facilities that were most impacted by individual storms and by month, by season, kind of going back overall here. But those are pretty readily available out there in looking at over the overall activity, and then what specific sectors were most impacted by that overall. But there's a lot more data sets than there used to be out there, and that is certainly one of the areas where there's been a lot of work done, from a standpoint of the specifics within the supply chain network and what kind of tropical impacts have occurred with individual storm seasons, et cetera, kind of going back through time. And those are still being put together and more readily available here every year.
Thanks, John. So here's another question. So can you advise your thoughts on the likelihood for rapid intensification events in this upcoming season, and where would we expect to see those impacts?
Yeah, great question. And again, that's a trend that we've seen with hurricanes, especially over the past 10 years, with the increasing number of these rapidly intensifying storms. And as we look ahead through this season, we do feel that the ocean environment is set up that there likely will be additional what we call RI storms here for this season. Right now, again, based on the current state of water temperatures and even expectations throughout the season, because of that warmth in the Gulf of Mexico, of all of the Atlantic basin, that is the area that right now has the most anomalous warmth and has more potential to provide that environment for a rapidly intensifying storm. So there's also some warmer waters off the East Coast, but a little bit further off, not just adjacent there, but a little bit further off. But it's more of the Gulf Coast or Gulf region here, through Mexico, or even some of the Northwest Caribbean islands in there as well, that have potential that could be impacted more by an RI storm, given kind of the right setup there this season.
Excellent, thank you. So we're almost getting to the end of the session here. So I think we've got time maybe for a couple more questions. So here's a question for you, John or Mark. I have supply chain exposure in China. Will they have an active typhoon season this year?
Yeah, great question. And because we wanted to focus this presentation on the Atlantic Basin, especially as we're working with, Alan and Kathy, overall here, we're global in everything we do. So we think about things on a global basis. The key to what happens in the West Pacific, again, the West Pacific is the most active tropical cyclone area on the globe. But the key is La Nina. With La Nina, there's good news and there's bad news. It's bad news for the Atlantic Basin with a very active season upcoming. But in the West Pacific, in areas like China, the Koreas, Japan, Northern Philippines, the fact that you have a La Nina, that tends to be a suppressor of tropical activity, their typhoons, in the West Pac. So it tends to be an enhancer in the Atlantic, which is really the focus of this presentation. But on the other side of the Pacific, in the West Pac, then with typhoon activity, it tends to be a suppressor. You tend to have below normal seasons with typhoons. It doesn't mean that you don't have any storms or any disruptions, but your risk tends to be lower than normal. And then vice versa, the risk in the Atlantic tends to be on the higher side. So there's a very strong correlation whether you're dealing with the Atlantic or the West Pac and what happens in the Equatorial Pacific. This year, of course, the driver La Nina. So again, that's good news for the West Pac in general, bad news for the Atlantic Basin. But awesome question.
Thanks, John. So this one, Kathy, you probably have a little more experience in this area, I'm afraid. But the question reads, hello, could mortality rates vary depending on the season?
Oh boy. I think we worry so much about the impacts from hurricanes, and flooding being one of those biggest impacts, that if we're not heeding those advisories that we get early, thankfully earlier, and the predictions are much better, then there is potential. It's just a matter of whether people listen to the news that's being brought to them, and organizations like Everstream who can who can help them see further ahead. But it's always a concern. Yeah.
Right.
Interesting
Absolutely.
question.
It is kind of puts I think it level sets, right? What all of this is about beyond logistics and supply chain. So I think we have time for one more question. So John and Mark, you've provided a lot of detail. What's the biggest difference between 2021 and 2022?
Yeah, I can answer that one. The biggest difference overall is that right now, actually, the Atlantic waters are just a touch cooler than what we had back a year ago. Again, something closer to normal. And so, again, that can change, but again, that does limit the development here, especially with those systems that move off of Africa and track across that region. And so that is one kind of limiting factor here coming up. And so, if let's say that sea surface temperatures or ocean waters start to actually cool down significantly within that region, then that would actually start to suppress things. And as a result of that, we would begin to start decreasing our ACE number, our ACE prediction for this year, and the risk would start to decrease from a macro standpoint. But that is the one main difference right now compared to a year ago at this time.
Well, thank you for that. So, okay, I think we're pretty much at the top end of our session. So thank you everybody for joining us today. Thank you again, once again, to our presenters, to Kathy, to Mark and John. Always love listening to all of you. So with that, we'll close the session, and thank you to everybody that joined us. Have a great day.